will now begin the fourth day for the Economics of Informality, an event promoted by the Network of Economic Researchers of Banco de la República, the School of Economics at the Universidad del Rosario and Colombia Científica. We will have translation available for the conference. Please make sure to click on the icon corresponding to your native language. To introduce the session Informality in the Time of COVID-19, I would like to welcome our keynote speaker, Ms. Pascaline Dupin, who is Professor of Economics at Stanford University. At the end of this speech, we will have 15 minutes for questions, which you may send in by chat and will be delivered to the keynote speaker by Andres Garcia, Assistant Professor at IAE University. Ms. Dupin and Mr. Garcia, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Adriana. We are very happy to have Professor Pascaline in the last day of our conference. Pascaline is a development economist. Her work has been devoted to understand the challenges facing by poor households in lower income countries. Pascaline is professor at Stanford University and faculty director of the Stanford King Center of on Global Development. She has published a huge number of papers in the top journals in our discipline in topics like health, education, financial inclusion, governance, and is also part of the board editors of American Economy Review, Quarterly Journal of Economics, and other important journals in economics. It's really a pleasure to have Pascaline in our conference. You can start sharing your screen, Pascaline, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
All right. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to be sharing some thoughts about informality with, to start, a precision for everybody, which is that I'm not a labor economist. I'm a development economist. And so when I think about the Economics of Informality, which is the title of this conference, oops, for some reason I cannot, okay, here, I can move my slide. I don't only think of the definitions that you've heard a lot about in the last 3 days, such as, informal firms, which are, to say, very quickly, essentially invisible to the government, or informal workers who are typically defined as having, no formal contract. I also think of many other things. When I think informal economy, I also think about the fact that 1 billion people, according to the UN, around the world at this time live in informal settlements. I also think about the fact that informal public transport networks are extremely important, and an estimate is that there are 100 billion such trips every year. I also think about informal trade, which is cross-border trade by foot that many households rely on for their livelihoods. And I also think of informal payments, which is essentially corruption, and many other things. The term informal in development economics, which is my field, shows up in so many domains. There's also informal insurance, there's informal consumption, which is the idea that if you buy goods, fruits, tomatoes from the local market, you're not going to be paying typically the value-added tax. The seller doesn't pay the value-added tax, and if you think that the value-added tax is going to be passed on to consumer, that means that the consumer buying from a local market versus a supermarket does not, the consumption doesn't show up in any book. There's also informal taxation, as it's known, which is the fact that many people may contribute to the public good in some informal way. And the incidence of that is something that has not been studied very much. And people also talk a lot about informal institutions, and that can go from social norms that are going to regulate a lot of the behaviors to things that are maybe very salient to your mind in Colombia, which is the presence of gangs that may actually substitute in some context for the formal authorities in terms of like, keeping some form of order, in exchange for, some racketeering, of course. So, I put ... on this because I'm sure that there are other things that could go in this list, but I just wanted to like start with this idea that it's important to keep in mind all other domains of informality, in particular because they also tend to overlap a lot. And so when we just look at one dimension, it's important to actually remember that the very same folks who may be informally employed also may live in informal settlements. And so one first way to show that, just using the eyeball metric, as I would call it, is if you look at the map of the world and you look at the distribution or the share of people who are informally employed, you're all familiar with the situation in Latin America. I think it's been a lot of the focus of the conference. My area of expertise is actually Sub-Saharan Africa, so I'm going to bring some evidence from there. But just from this map, you see that actually informality is still, extremely prevalent, not just in Latin America, but in Sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. And something else I want to point out from this map, which is using data from the ILO, and to build it, we took any data reported by the ILO ever since 2011, and she said that for a number of countries, in Sub-Saharan Africa, there's actually no statistic, okay? And so the fact that there is no statistic on the level of informality in the DRC, or in Ethiopia, this is actually symptomatic of the fact that it actually may be, extremely high, because you don't even have data because there is not even a formal process of getting a sense of the size of the informal economy. But then what I wanted to point out is that if you overlay this map of employment with a map of people living in informal settlements or slums, this is calculating the share of the urban population living in what's defined as a slum as per the UN Habitat definition. Essentially, these two maps look very much the same. These very same areas that have a lot of informal employment also have a lot of informal settlements. This is something really cool that is called Where is My Transport? Is an organization that actually maps informal public transport networks. If you're like me and you love public transport, when you go to a new city, you're like, oh great, I'm going to discover the city by getting on a bus. And you can find official bus routes. But you cannot find anywhere the informal bus routes. It's something like people kind of know. If you live in this neighborhood, you have a sense of which minibus goes where. The minibus is going to have a different name. If it's in Kenya, it's going to be called the matatu. And if it's you're in Bangladesh, it's going to be you're going to prefer the tuk-tuk. Like wherever you go, you're going to have a different name. But it's going to be very difficult for you to get any idea of what's which informal bus you could take to go where. And so this company is actually mapping these things. And this is a map of where they have already started doing some work. And as you can see, again, the same usual suspect, they've started being very busy in Sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, and also in Mexico. And in fact, this is a map from their website that shows what this means. This is a formal network of Mexico City. And this is in orange added to it, the informal network. And you can see that, actually the informal network dwarfs the formal network. So it's like a very important aspect of people's everyday life, is like how they can go from one place to the next. Now, these are some statistics from Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire. Abidjan is the capital city of Côte d'Ivoire. And we sampled, households, who don't live like in the city center, but folks who live kind of like in the relatively, poor outskirts of the city. And we are building a panel data set. And so I'm going to tell you more about this in a minute. But first, I just wanted to show some statistics broken down by formal and informal employment status. to show how these various dimensions of informality are very much related. So here you see, and we have about 2,900 household individuals in our sample. So it's not tiny, and you see that we have the formal and the informal. The great majority of those who are employed are actually informal. I obviously should have put that statistic here, I forgot, but it's like 60% of those who are informally employed, and just about 10% are formally employed. You also have among the self-employed, those who are formal and informal, and we have a lot of unemployment. Actually, a third of our sample is unemployed. And you can see that first, they don't live in the same area. So if you're formally employed, you tend to live in an area where other people are more likely to be employed as well. Those who are formally employed tend to be more engaged actually in transfers with others. So they are more likely to receive money and to lend money. So that's actually interesting that your participation in the informal transfer economy is actually higher if you're formal compared to informal. You can see here the p-values, which is showing whether the differences between these two columns are significant, all below 0.05. So these differences between the two groups are quite salient. Slightly less so if we compare formal and informal among the self-employed. Okay. But what I want to point out here is that if you're informal, the likelihood that you have a bank account is very low at 13% compared to 67% if you're formally employed. And there is also a gap among the self-employed, but it's much less pronounced. If you also have the likelihood that people have formally borrowed money is much lower if you're informal. Having health insurance is extremely uncommon. Which is, in part why the government of Côte d'Ivoire is trying to push for a new, universal health insurance scheme. Even having an ID card is much less likely, and this is not because the informal are less likely to be citizens. Actually, it's equal share that are citizens, and it's very high. It's above 90%. I mean, Côte d'Ivoire is a country that brings in a lot of migrants from surrounding countries, but nevertheless, over 90% of the population in our sample is citizen. But you can see that only 60% of those who are informal have an ID. And for those who follow this closely, I don't think there are many of you here in this audience, but Côte d'Ivoire is about to have a presidential election, which is extremely contested and subject to a lot of worries for many people currently in Abidjan, thinking, well, are we going to have another spate of violence due to the election? And so when you're about to have a presidential election and only 60% of those who are informal have an ID, and having an ID is necessary to be able to vote, you can already see how informality also means being, cut out from the political process and having much less political agency. And then here, like in Abidjan, there's actually a lot of people who live in slums, and in our sample, we oversample the slums because we're interested in that topic. And so we do find that those who are informal are, more likely to live in slums. Also, even those who are formal, a good share also live in slums. And one other takeaway from this table is that if you look at the self-employed who are in a formal firm, so that's going to be a firm that's registered with the authorities, they look, in fact, a little bit more like the informal than they look like the formally employed. Okay, so in this context, there is really something very separate, which is if you have a formal job, which is kind of like the holy grail for people, you're doing kind of much better on every dimension. And then if you cannot have a formal job, then people are going to be, maybe trying to have their own business and register it. But typically they're not going to manage, and they're going to be mostly either informally self-employed or informally employed. Okay. If there is any question, please feel free to interrupt. Another piece of data also from Abidjan. This is a different sample. This is a sample of market vendors. And there are two types of market vendors in this traditional market. There are those who are registered with a local municipal government, and those are supposed to pay monthly market taxes. And the amount that they are supposed to pay monthly is a function of the size of their business. And then you have daily merchants. These are the folks who can just come. They don't come necessarily every day. If there's an issue at home, maybe they don't come, and they only have to pay this daily fee to the local tax collector on the days they work. So every day they are supposed to be visited by a tax collector who is going to charge a fee, always the same amount. And we asked these vendors whether the tax collection happens as it should. And you see a lot of interesting things there. So first, the tax collector doesn't seem to be coming daily systematically. Only 74% of our daily merchants reported that out of the past 10 days at which they were on the market, the tax was collected from them. So that these tax collectors are not necessarily doing the job that they're supposed to be doing. 60% say that it's possible to get away without paying the tax. That's among the daily, and even among those who are registered and we are supposed to pay monthly, 50% say that it's possible to get away without paying the tax. Okay, so that's huge. People, there may be some underreporting here, but quite a number of people say they've heard that some tax collectors pocket the money that is paid to them. So that's 23% of the daily merchants. It's less for the monthly because the monthly folks actually have to go to an office to pay typically. So there's more formality to that payment process. Many people say it's possible to delay the tax payment. So if you're late, you can ask for clemency from the tax collector. It's going to let you be late, but possibly in exchange, it's going to expect to keep a cut of the payment. And there's very little oversight. So less than half of the daily merchants said that they were audited at least once in the past 6 months. What does it mean? It means that typically there should be an auditor who comes by the market and check that people have a little ticket that proves that they have paid their tax. So that's a way to verify that the tax collector has been doing her job or his job. And this happened relatively rarely. A little bit more so for the monthly vendors. Many people have never been audited, even though they've been working on a given market for years. And ultimately, people readily admit that they don't pay, the right amount of the full amount. 73% say they have paid the right amount, which means that 27% have not paid the right amount. And this is likely underreported. It's much smaller, those not paying the right amount among the monthly. So the registered businesses, and overall, people are relatively satisfied with tax collection because it seems like it's a win-win. The tax collector, makes a bit of money on the side, and the merchants have to pay less. And so, yes, when you have what's called corruption with theft, in the Schleifer and Vishny definition, then everybody kind of benefits except for the public good. So this, all these points I'm making about the various dimensions of informality and their interconnections suggest to me that there may be many ways to which informality breeds informality. And so just kind of thinking from a pure conceptual framework point of view, why one could think that one type of informality can contribute to another, and maybe there is some sort of informality trap. Well, imagine that you're living in an informal settlement, then typically you don't have property rights. That may make it very difficult for you to register a business if you run your business from home, because typically when you register a business, you have to provide an address. And so it may be difficult to provide an address if you don't have a formal address. And you may also need to make informal payments to local authorities to avoid eviction, or to avoid to be forced to move your shack out of the place that you've been squatting, and so that means like you have actually an interest in having corrupt officials because that allows you to stay in your informal settlement. And in fact, you may also, have to rely on informal institutions, in particular local gang, for protection if, informal settlements are areas where the city, the municipality, the government is not going to provide any public goods, in particular, any policing or any safety. And you may less likely to have a national ID again if you need to have an address to be able to register and on the official voter list, for example, which means that you cannot easily participate in the formal institutions, but maybe you can participate in the informal institutions. So if you can't vote, you can't choose who the elected leader is going to be, but maybe you can influence the composition of the local informal authorities through some other means, and there may be some like informal voting going on at some level to decide who is going to be the local leader. Likewise, you can think of informal employment as being often associated with irregular income. That makes it kind of difficult to commit to a regular, formal, fixed rent. And so maybe, that means that your likelihoods to prefer living in informal settlements where either you don't have to, pay rent at all if you just set up a shack on some, squatting an area where you don't have to pay rent, or often you have to pay rent, but the amount of rent is going to be much lower and so easier to pay out of your irregular income. And then, you don't have access typically to benefits. And so that means that you need informal insurance as a safety net. And so that means that, informal networks are going to be extremely important to provide you with the kind of, security or like help when you need it. And that, in turn may lead to the, I would say the perseverance or the hysteresis in the likelihood that informal networks keep mattering enormously for other domains, like who you employ and whether you're gonna keep your cousin employed in your own little business and stay informal compared to becoming formal and hiring somebody else than your cousin who would maybe be more competent and make you more productive. It's also going to be very difficult to access formal credits if you are informally employed. Often banks are going to require, paychecks, contracts to be able to grant you credits. They are not going to be thinking you have the right credentials if you cannot provide, first a formal address, but also a formal work contract or like a guarantee that you can pay back. When people make a lot of informal payments to authorities, or authorities, accept informal payments, it actually makes it possible for formal firms to hire informal labor without, being punished for it. Or it allows for informal traders to cross borders. And so, that the fact that you may have a lot of informal payments in the economy is kind of like feeds again some of these other forms of informality. So one point I want to make when you see all of these interconnected forms of informality, that the question of is informality a choice? I feel like my own reading of the literature on informality in Latin America, and especially I've had over the years a number of students who are extremely interested, for example, in the Seguro Popular project in social security project in Mexico. And recently, Mexico has enrolled 3 million high school and college students into the formal social security system. There's always this the fear, I feel, among authorities especially in Latin America, that anything you do to provide benefits to the informal is going to lead to some form of moral hazard, and people are going to choose to stay informal because it's going to be kind of cheaper for them, or better for them, and so they are willing to take on this burden of informality because it's the right there's the right calculus for them. And from a development perspective and also a sub-Saharan Africa perspective, I think this is maybe this view is maybe very specific to Latin America. My understanding of the situation, at least from the evidence I know, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, that firms that are informal may choose not to formalize even when the process is made very simple for them. But it's typically because they would not be viable if they were formal. And so I don't really think of this as being a choice. It's really a constrained choice. And also, from the South African perspective, the thing, and I think also for most of South Asia, and my bet would be for most folks also in Latin America, most workers who are informal would much prefer a formal contract, with benefits and paid leave and things like that. But simply are not able to find one, and there are very high unemployment rates, especially for youth, and people end up having to do something on the side of the road because there is nothing else for them to do. But obviously the holy grail remains the formal job. And likewise, people have sometimes argued that people don't move out of informal settlements even after somehow their finances would allow them to do so. But here, I think it's important to also keep in mind the geography of cities and the fact that moving out of an informal settlement often means actually moving out of the city, or much further away, where then reaching jobs may be much more difficult. And as cities get crowded and commute times can be extremely long, sometimes people may be trapped in an informal settlement because it's the only affordable housing within a reasonable distance from job opportunities. And so coming to COVID-19 now, I think the main reason to avoid informality when possible, and I think that the main argument that people will tell you when you ask them why their dream is not to be the owner of a firm or even a big firm or a registered firm. Their dream is to be a civil servant. The main reason is to avoid the vulnerability that comes with informality. The fact that you're always going to be on the brink of some potential disaster. Nothing is quite stable. That you're always at the risk of being kicked out, déguerpi, as they say in Côte d'Ivoire, or evicted from your informal settlement, or at the risk of losing your income source. And this last point, I think has never been as evident as this year, the year 2020, which is the year of COVID-19. In fact, I think we should rename COVID-19 COVID-20, because even if it showed up in 19, obviously we will all associate it with the year 2020, and I think we can't wait for it to be over. So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to go through some very simple, again, kind of more from a conceptual framework point of view, thoughts on the many reasons to be very fearful about the consequences that the COVID-19 crisis will have for informality in these various domains. And then I'll share some data that helps us think through the extent to which these mechanisms that may be at play are there. And you'll see that actually the data that I have to share is not that complete, and many of the aspects of informality that I mentioned, there is very little data on. And so I think this is kind of like a call for those of you in the audience who have the chance to have the ability, the funding, the resources, the time to do data collection via phone, maybe with various samples. There are a lot of issues that we need more data on, and that governments will need data on to make decisions. And so it's important to do this data collection if you can. All right, so the first, concern, I mean, I guess there are two broad issues with informality in COVID-19. One is the extent to which the informal are going to be much more likely to be at risk of being infected by COVID-19. And the other one is the extent to which they are going to be much more likely to suffer economically from the crisis. Okay, so on the first one, it's very trivial. Obviously, when we think about informality and exposure to COVID, there are many factors at play. For those who are in informal settlements, there's very high density in these slums, so that means it's much harder to practice social distancing. In fact, there's a large number of people per dwelling. Okay, so it's and sometimes it's not always from the same household. People can share with extended households. So even if people manage to stay within their dwelling, it's still a lot of people. Typically, you have communal water sources. That means people are going to have to meet at these water points, and so transmission can happen through there. There's going to be very limited access to sanitation and hygiene facilities. So we've been told over and over to wash our hands with soap all the time. It's very difficult to do that when you don't have running water at home, and you have to go to a central place. Obviously, a lot of these informal transport networks, are extremely crowded. These minibuses that take, these 14-seaters in Kenya that typically take, 22 people plus, 2 chicken and a goat. That's just makes, for, very tricky social distancing. And people who shop disproportionately at markets, traditional markets, there's much more crowding there than in supermarkets. In a supermarket, you just have, as you can walk through the alleys. You don't actually interact with anyone unless you get to the cashier, and another cashier, they can have a shield. But obviously, in traditional market, you have interaction with every merchant, and it's pretty tricky to keep also 6 feet distancing when sometimes the stores are next to each other and there are little alleyways in between. Okay, so the fact that transmission is likely to be much higher in informal areas is pretty clear from just basic, theoretical point of view, if I may say. And in fact, the few studies that have looked at the seroprevalence of COVID-19 in slums are kind of alarming. So this is data from Mumbai in India. In July, a seroprevalence study was done. So seroprevalence is when you test people's blood for antibodies, and that tells you whether they've been exposed to the disease already, and so their immune system has responded by building antibodies. And this compares slum areas with non-slum areas, and it's quite impressive is not the right word, heartbreaking to see that essentially on average it's 54% of folks in the slum areas, and whether it's in the north or the west or the north, there are different areas of the slums, but throughout they essentially find very high rates of seroprevalence, 54%. Okay, which would mean that the virus really spread like wildfire in these communities. The estimates for the likely share of folks in the US, for example, who've been who would have antibodies if such a seroprevalence study would be done are much more around 10%. Okay, and as you know, the US has been very badly affected by the virus. In the non-slum areas, it's actually not that trivial either, but it's 14% on average. Okay, so clearly a big difference between 14% average for the non-slum areas and 54% for the slum areas. And the other, I actually spent quite a bit of time trying to look for these seroprevalence studies in other contexts, and not very many have been done. So I just found this other one from Buenos Aires, a slum area, the Barrio Mujica where they, surprisingly find the exact same number. I mean, it's not 54, but it's 53%, and they don't have it for non-slums, so I don't have the comparison there. But they estimate that across age group and possibly even more for the children, for the young, the teenagers, very high prevalence, zero prevalence as well. Suggesting that again, no wonder if someone gets infected by COVID from a community which is living in informal settlements, it's gonna spread very fast and very quickly. You will have a lot of people infected. Here they estimate that they did this in June, and this was exactly 3 months after the first case in that barrio was known. Okay, so it's very rapid transmission. So this is all I have to say about the health side. The fact that being informal makes you much more at risk. In fact, I forgot to mention one other channel actually, which is the fact that if you're informal, typically you're much more likely also to work in services and to be in contact with very many people, and that also can contribute. But now let's move on to the economic impacts, and here I'm gonna think through the various channels through which informality means that resilience to COVID-induced economic shocks, in particular the lockdowns that have been a quite common response of governments to the pandemic, is much lower if you're informal. Okay, so going the wrong way. So first, I mean, that's like something that everybody has already said, I'm sure, and documented quite well in this conference, the fact that your daily earnings, if you're a daily earner, you're informal, you go every day, get your sell stuff on the side of the road, or work for somebody else on a daily basis. If suddenly there is a shelter-in-place order or lockdown and no one is supposed to be out of their house, that means no income. Okay, so in contrast with wage employee who has a contract and is going to be paid, at the end of the month, no matter what. That's obviously a big problem. Obviously, the wage employee may be laid off if the crisis continues. But at least there is no immediate going from having daily earnings to having zero on the table. Another point that I think has not been looked at very closely, but I think is very interesting to think about, is the fact that in many contexts, the lockdown or shelter-in-place involved the closure of markets, of traditional markets, and the closure of borders. Okay, so when you close markets and you close borders and you make it impossible for informal cross-border trade, especially food trade, then that means that the consumers are forced to go shop in the supermarkets. Okay, you cannot now just buy your tomatoes from the side of the road. The tomatoes are not making it across the border from wherever they typically come, or they can't even make it from the rural areas because the roads are essentially closed, and so now you have to go to the supermarket. Somehow the supermarkets got a good deal out of this, lockdown measures, because they are the ones who could keep operating, and they tended to have a lot of folks coming in, stockpiling. But when you shop at the supermarket, you have to pay the value-added tax, and so the prices are typically going to be higher. So these channels from not only you lose your daily earning, but on top of that, now you face higher prices. It's interesting. I don't think there's very much data on this. If you have some data on this, or if you know how to come up with data on this, I think it would be a very fascinating area of research. Obviously, when you have restrictions on informal public transport, since so many people rely on those informal minibuses, it's going to be very difficult for people to travel, and so even if you're allowed to go work, you may not be able to if you don't have the public transport to do that. And obviously, if you do not have a formal financial account, or kind of like a way for the government reach you easily, to transfer money easily, then even if safety net programs are put in place, such as cash transfer programs to help the informal, how do you actually give money in the hands of people? In the US, the relief package for COVID-19 involved, checks being sent to many American households to help them. Not very big checks, but checks nevertheless, and it's been documented that it really helped avert people slipping into poverty too quickly. If you don't have a formal address, you don't have a formal account, how do you get a check or a transfer? And then on top of it, it's like a double whammy, because your own income goes down, but then typically people who are informal often, when they have the chance to have a relative abroad, are going to rely on remittances from abroad to help them weather negative shocks. But since the shock was worldwide, and most likely the relatives abroad also faced a shock, remittances are likely to have dried up, and so really income sources are much lower. So what do we know now about that? These are just like all the ways to which, not all the ways, it's some of the ways. I'm sure you can come up with more. Some of the ways to which the informal are going to suffer, and I'm going to try to share what I've been able to gather on this from various sources of data. So I'm going to share data from Colombia and Mexico that was collected by IPA, Innovations for Poverty Action, as part of their Recovery surveys. And then I'm going to dive into two sources of data that I've been involved in collecting. One is going to be Côte d'Ivoire. Again, we are building this panel survey in Abidjan that I mentioned before. That's with Marcel Fafchon at Stanford and Eva Lestin, also from Stanford, applying to grad school soon. So watch out for her. And then some work that I've been doing in Ghana with Estelle and Michael Kramer, looking at youth. We have this panel study of youth. We've been following them for 12 years, and we have exogenous variation in education levels, which translated into differences in access to formal jobs. And so we're going to be able to look at the extent to which this helped people weather the COVID crisis a bit better. So, Colombia and Mexico, because I felt really bad having only Africa examples, but and then Abidjan and Ghana, and so these are the three data sources. And just to put things into perspective, this is the extent to which they were affected by the COVID-19 health crisis. So I put here as a benchmark Paris and San Francisco. Why? Because I'm French, okay? And actually I was in France last year. I was on sabbatical, so I was in Paris in March 2019 when the COVID-19 crisis hit Europe. I was in Paris, and you can see Paris was very badly affected. This is a number of daily COVID-19 deaths per million people. So, France, like Europe, did not do great back in April. San Francisco is essentially, the closest city to where I live. I'm at Stanford University in California, so that's where I am now. And then I put Mexico City here, since this is one of the areas for which we have the Recovery survey. And I put, Bogota, where it seems like, the situation became bad somewhat later, but it seems like it was badly hit. I put Accra and Abidjan, where are the two areas where we have some data from Ghana. But as you can see, in fact, you can't even see them. Those two countries, they are kind of like hard. There was so little COVID there that you don't see them on the graph. And then what did I miss? Okay, I also put Delhi there because I mentioned India before. Okay, so as you can see, there was the extent to which these different areas that we're going to be looked at were affected from a health perspective is quite differential. Okay, but the point I want to make is that the economic ripple effects of the crisis are actually likely to be felt everywhere. Why? Because if you look at mobility, and this is using Google mobility data, it's actually very cool data that you can find online. Even this is also data from our world in data that you can download online. But here you can download this information. It's very interesting. It's just like it's Google using essentially your cell phone, my cell phone, all of our cell phones to collect information about how much people have been moving around. And so this is indexed based, it's a value 0 for, a week in February, whether they take as a benchmark, or an average, I think, between January and February, that's the benchmark. And then how much mobility was there since then. And you can see in March, it just plummeted. Just in Paris, where it was with a very, very strict lockdown for 2 months, where there was, no movement. In San Francisco, there was also a shelter in place in California. But, you can see that Mexico City also had a huge drop in mobility, and, it's not quite recovered the levels. But even the 2 countries I showed you had essentially minimal rates of COVID-19 deaths. Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, you still see actually pretty substantial changes in mobility. So what happened there is that, this is Accra and this is Abidjan. It's not as pronounced as this, really drastic drop, because they didn't have like a complete lockdown. But it's still, a 40%, 60% drop in mobility that lasted, a couple of months. And, they have, Ghana has not completely recovered. Abidjan has recovered in terms of mobility. But so this means that, you don't just want to look at the numbers of deaths, the number of cases to say which country was affected, which country was not affected, because obviously to avoid transmission, many countries adopted very strict measures that led to a complete, how do you say, change in the economic activity. And so you may see very big effects of the COVID-19 crisis even in Abidjan and Accra, even though there was very little actual death. Okay, and so that's what we're going to be able to look at. So just starting with the IPA Recovery Survey. So IPA, which is again Innovations for Poverty Action, is kind of like a survey, a non-profit survey firm that many researchers, especially development economists, use to collect data in many different contexts. So they have kind of like a ready data collection system in many places that they kind of immediately put to use when the COVID-19 crisis started, to collect a whole bunch of data. So they essentially had existing samples of individuals in many countries, and they used that to do rapid phone surveys to understand what was going on. And they did that in Burkina Faso, Colombia, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Mexico, the Philippines, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Uganda, and Zambia. And with Nicolas Aguirre students here at Stanford, we wanted to use that data to be able to say a little bit about informality around these countries. Unfortunately, there was not, that many of these data sets that actually provided information about who was informal and who was not, according to any of these dimensions that I mentioned before. So that's in the end limits what we can do. But these data sets are public. I encourage you to check this IPA Recover website if you're interested. There may be some information in there that's useful for your own research purposes. For now, it's really in Colombia and in Mexico, so it's fortunate since I wanted to have a little bit of Latin America in this talk. That's where we could actually get information about informality, although it's not complete. So they collected data in May 2020 for Colombia and in June, July 2020 for Mexico. The sample size for Colombia is 1,500 people. There is information about the informality status for almost everybody. For Mexico, we don't quite know why. The informality information is only there for about 40% of the sample. So I'm going to show you some graphs based on this data, and just keep in mind these sample sizes. Okay. How is it? The information we have about formality is pretty crude, and essentially whether people have a written contract, and so we are going to call informal people who do not have a written contract. And then we're going to look at trajectories based on their pre-COVID-19 employment. So how do we define that? It's going to be people that reported working for someone else for pay or running their own business or farm, or helping in a family business or farm in February 2020. So anybody who reports some activity like that is considered to be employed before COVID-19. So essentially, you want to think of people who are like active and you know, not inactive. And during COVID-19 employment is whether people report working at least 1 hour during the last week. And if they do that, then we consider them employed during COVID-19. Okay, so it's a pretty low bar. You only need to have worked at least 1 hour. Okay, and these questions were only asked to people who were active or employed in February 2020. Okay. So first, just something on informality rates, you know, and by gender in this survey. So in Colombia, that based on the sample that IPA had in their books, they have 60% of the men who are informal, and just shy of 70% for the women. In Mexico, it's actually lower; it's more around 50%, slightly higher for women again. And this is a share of those who were actually employed in February 2020. So already you see that if you're formal, you are more likely to be employed than if you're informal. So it's just not quite very clear what it means to be formal and not employed. So that's one thing from the survey that needs to be clarified. But for those who are informal, it's easier to think through what it means to not be employed. And people who at the time of the survey, or rather reports, they were surveyed in May or June, but they report retrospectively that as of February 2020, they were not employed, and that's about 40% or 35% in Colombia and 30% in Mexico. So now what happened to those who said yes in February 2020, I was employed? Then what happened to them during COVID-19? So they were surveyed either in May for Colombia or in June, July for Mexico. And this is whether they worked in the last week. And so of the, all of those, so 100% of these folks, were reported being working in February, and now it's about 60% of them in the formal sector who said that they worked at least an hour in the past week. And 40% in the informal. So it's actually pretty striking that even those who are formally employed seems to have suffered quite a bit and report being less likely to have worked. Although it could be that they don't have because of lockdown measures. Maybe they don't go to work. They cannot work from home. And they are still paid, but just not working. So that could be one explanation. Whereas those folks, we know for sure, if they can go to work since they're informal, they can have no income. And in Mexico, it's not as bad, but still a dip. Okay. And this is by gender. So for women, it seems to be a much greater reduction in employment because of COVID-19 than for men. And it's not surprising since in many contexts schools were closed, and so that means that somebody had to stay home to stay with the kids. Another question that series of questions that the IPA Recovery Survey asked was hours worked during the last week compared to a typical week before COVID-19. And for income, they didn't actually ask about income levels, but they asked income earned during the last week compared to a typical week before COVID-19. And so what you see here is broken down by gender and by country and by formality status. So, this is here. And this is showing among those who are formal, 35% reports that they work less during COVID than before. Some report that they worked more. Okay. For the informal, it's a much clearer picture where 60% said that they work less. Okay. And for Mexico, it's an identical number. So it's a very large number of people reporting working less hours, and very many people reporting earning less income. Okay. Extremely few people say that they reported earning more income now, under COVID than before. And, over 70% in the informal sector in both Colombia and Mexico saying that they are earning less. Okay. So this is, what essentially you can say from this recover data set with doesn't paint a great picture. It will obviously be very nice to know a little bit more about the extent to which consumption was affected. And so we're able to do that in a different context, which is Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, where I've been involved in collecting some data. And so what is that data we have? Well, we are planning to build this panel data set, and we had just completed the first wave in February 2020. So, we are just finished with our first wave of data, and we had a representative sample of close to 3,000 individuals living in the outskirts of Abidjan. And in fact, just to make sure that you guys know what I'm talking about, I'm going to show you, for a second, I'm going to leave my presentation and go to, no, sorry, this is not what I want to show you. I have a map somewhere. Yeah, I'm going to go here and show you, this is, this is Latin America, obviously, this is Africa. And we zoom in, Côte d'Ivoire is here. And if we zoom in, this is Abidjan, okay? Abidjan is on the lagoon, okay? This is the city. And as you can see, there's a big park here. This is the plateau area, this is Cocody. These are the really busy part of the city where, rents are much higher. So and also this part, so we did not actually sample people from these areas. We focused on the outskirts. So this area, Yopougon, where a lot of poor people live, Abobo and Anyama in the north, and then Port-Boué here, these areas, and Banjaville. We are trying to also understand the extent to which the still rural areas, but soon to be urbanized, are being affected by the growth of the city, and how the folks who live in the outskirts fare. Okay, so that's our that's Abidjan. That's our sample. Let me go back to my presentation, and in fact, I also have a link to a map now where you can see. So remember, this is now the part of what I was showing you on the Google map. These white areas here are all the waterways and the lagoons. And here we are showing this grid map, and the areas that are colored are the areas where we have sampled individuals. Okay, so this is our survey representation. And in dark red are the areas that have a relatively higher share of people living in slums. And so we oversampled people who lived in slums. So that's our sample. And because we had just finished this baseline just before the COVID-19 crisis hit, we had very fresh information about how people were doing, what they were doing. And we had phone numbers for most of them. And so in July 2020, we deployed a phone survey to be able to look at what had happened to these folks in the meantime. And we asked retrospective questions to retrace trajectories since March 2020. And this is what we find. So this is monthly income, the mean income by gender. And these levels are actually very low. 4,000 francs CFA is just about $7, and this is like monthly income. So we are talking about really abysmal level of income. It's in part because we have about 30% of our sample that's unemployed, and for women it's actually higher. So so that includes obviously the zeros, people who make zero income. So people are not, and in our sample in Abidjan are relatively poor. But as you can see, there is a big drop between what we measured at baseline. So the baseline went from December, January, February. So as a shorthand, I'm going to call that period January 2020, think of it as a pre-COVID. It's an average of the respondents we have for December, January, February. And this is March, knowing that the measures taken by the government in Côte d'Ivoire started taking place mid-March. Schools were closed on March 15. And so that's an indication of when the crisis started, or when restrictions were put in place. And you can see immediately there was a drop in income. April was the lowest point, and actually things did not quite recover even by June, even though the mobility graph I showed you suggested that, you know, right after that is when things went back to normal. So we're going to be doing another round of surveys for this same group in a month. We're just waiting for the election to be done, and then we'll be able to do another follow-up. This is the same graph, but this time instead of breaking it down by gender, I broke it by employment status. And so you have the formal and the informal employed, the formal and the informal self-employed, and the unemployed. And so here you see that the formal employed are actually the better off by a wide margin, so a great margin. So at baseline, you know, before COVID, clearly those who have a formal job are doing way better than anybody else. The second group is the formal self-employed, and then the informal workers and the informal self-employed are really just, you know, equally poor. And then obviously you have the unemployed. Okay, and what you see here that everybody was hit by the crisis. Income fell for everyone, and you know, remarkably, it actually fell almost, you know, quite a lot for the formal workers as well. Now, obviously, they start from a higher situation, so they end up having still a level of income on average that is about, you know, the same as what the others started with, or even better. Okay, so it's not like they end up being poor, but still, it's remarkable that everybody reports a decline in income, and, you know, not that much recovery over the next 3 months. This is by slum status. If you live in an urban slum in blue or not in a slum in red, again, not surprisingly, if you're not living in a slum, you know, you're better off to start with. But everybody was hit, which that's also something that I was a little bit surprised by. I would have expected the difference to be the slopes to be actually a bit different between the two groups. But if anything, those who live in slums, you know, had a slightly, you know, more modest slope. And this is based on how you go to work. So we have, you know, a few lucky folks who have a personal car, 4% in our sample, and they are clearly the ones who do better. But they also were affected by the crisis. People who rely on buses, 20% also were affected. Essentially, everybody was affected, kind of like equally, irrespective of their means of transportation. Even people who walk, 57% of our sample walks to work, and they were, you know, they start worse off, but they also were affected, although maybe slightly less, given that they have, you know, less room to go down than the others. This is by commuting time. You know, some folks go quite far to work. It takes them more than 60 minutes to commute. I mean, maybe they don't go that far, but the traffic is so bad in Abidjan, it takes them quite a while. They were, you know, affected very badly by the crisis. Those who commute a bit less were in a slightly less steep slope, but this, again, you know, the overall picture that everybody seems to have been affected quite, you know, quite a bit. These are transition matrices. This is conditional on being an informal worker as of our baseline in January 2020. We come back to you and check what are your whereabouts. What's very striking from this graph is that among those who were informal in January, by March 2020, so 30% are inactive. By April, it's 40%. Okay, so that's like essentially the loss of opportunities to work. That's very clear. A bunch of them went into like self-employment, but only about half or less than half of those who were like informally, you know, employed in January are still informally employed during the crisis. For those who are formally employed, again, maybe surprisingly, there is a huge drop as well, but not as bad. And so it's more around 70%. In fact, there is like a dip here around April, like the core of the crisis, but then it starts going back up again. And so the formally employed also suffered loss of jobs, but not as bad as the informal. And this is another way to look at it. This is if you take you know, the distribution of those who are informal in January. You know, about a third said they were salaried, about a third were self-employed, and a third were occasional. So this occasional versus salary, these are both different, slightly different forms of informal employment in this context. This is how they were distributed in January. and you see a big chunk of them become inactive in the following period. That's for male. And for women, it's like very dramatic, the extent to which essentially most of the female who are informal, actually informal self-employed, many of them I don't know if I want to say lost their business, but stopped doing their business, maybe because they had to be home, and many of them became inactive. Okay, this is for those who were formal to start with. The situation is not as bad as this one, but still actually quite a lot of disruption, as we mentioned before, for men as well as for women. A lot of women who have a formal business, according to the definition we have, also had to stop their activity, and a lot became inactive. Okay, so now how do these changes in income and jobs translate into consumption? We have food expenditure per capita over the last 7 days by employment type in the pre-COVID and in the post-COVID period, and you can see that for the those who are salaried workers, formally salaried workers. This is for women to start with. There's not that much of a drop on average. Also, some ended up consuming much less. Maybe those who lost their job. For the informal salaried workers, they start with lower consumption and a bigger drop. And for the again the informal self-employed, a bigger drop than for formal self-employed, and the unemployed to start with, which are kind of badly off, are even worse off now. So these are kind of like noisy, but it's makes sense. Overall, the patterns make sense. The distribution of consumption, maybe surprisingly, pre-COVID, you don't have massively big differences in consumption level. This is for food across types of employment, but the shock is more pronounced for those that we expect to be more vulnerable. This is the same for male. Okay, so now let me just talk briefly about the last data set I wanted to share, and then I'm gonna conclude since I'm almost out of time. Is this Ghana Youth Panel Survey? This is a study that I've been doing with Esther Duflo and Michael Kramer, whom I don't need to introduce. I'm sure you know them since they both won the Nobel Prize last year alongside Abhijit Banerjee. So they've been working with me on this for 12 years. So back in 2008, we started an RCT, a randomized control trial, trying to estimate the returns to secondary education. This is a context in Ghana, like in many sub-Saharan African countries, where secondary education wasn't free. It's still not free in many countries. And governments were really wondering, should we make secondary education free the way we've made primary education free? And so to help with that debate, we started a program where we randomized access to scholarships. We've fundraised to be able to provide scholarships to just below 700 youth. And we sampled 2,000 youth that were eligible to go to school but couldn't afford it. We randomized the 700 scholarships among them, and then we've been following them up ever since. And so first, the scholarship had a massive impact on educational attainment, an increase in 27 percentage points in the likelihood that they completed secondary school. And then we actually did a very good job following up on this. So we have less than 5% attrition. As of 2019, we had done a round of surveys. Summer 2019, we had less than 5% attrition. And so when the COVID-19 crisis hit, we thought, oh, it's probably worth going back and doing another survey, another round of phone surveys to understand the causal role of education in resilience to a shock such as COVID-19. So again, Ghana, very much like Côte d'Ivoire, is a country where there were a lot of restrictions put in place by the government to avert the spread of the virus. Those were very successful in the sense that there's been, a grand total of 300 deaths due to COVID reported in Ghana for 20 million people. So it's like in per capita terms, it's extremely low mortality from COVID in Ghana, but livelihoods were disrupted by the restrictions. And so we suspected that this may, those who had gone to school may actually be better off, because from our 2019 survey, we knew that especially for the girls, we see very differential returns for boys and girls, but for girls who had gotten a scholarship, we knew that they were significantly more likely to be formally employed compared to those who had not gotten a scholarship, okay? And so we were suspecting that maybe they would be more resilient to the shock. So between June and September, we did a phone survey with our respondents. We were able to reach 85% of them. So typically when we try to do surveys with this cohort that we built in 2008, by phone we're able to reach 85%, and then to get to 95%, we go in person and finish the tracking in person. Obviously, we couldn't do that because of COVID, so now we are sticking just to the phone survey. So we have a bit more attrition than usual, but it's still a very high completion rate, and it's not differential between treatment and control group. The treatment, remember, is whether or not you got a scholarship to go to secondary school back in 2008. And if you've gotten a scholarship, 75% have completed secondary school. If you've not gotten a scholarship, it's just about 46% who completed secondary school. So the treatment effect here is essentially picking up this differential likelihood of having completed secondary school. And we find for women that this labor index, which is an index of whether they have a formal job with benefits and other perks like that, we have a big significant effect here. This is an index. The mean for women is actually negative. They are much less likely to have such a job compared to men, but we have a huge treatment effect of 0.17 standard deviation. And in particular, one of the type of formal job that women are more likely to have if they've gotten secondary education is a public sector job. And they are much less likely to be self-employed, okay? And what we find already for 2020, that the coefficient of variation of their monthly earnings went down. Again, we never see much going on for men. I mean, there's a little bit of effect on self-employment, but they are less likely to be self-employed, but they're not more likely to be wage employed. So essentially, they are more likely to be inactive if they got a scholarship, which is a whole other story. But it's like because they've got an education, these guys, they don't want to settle on an informal job, and so just waiting for the formal job to come along. And as they wait, they free ride off of their parents and still work, still live at home. So they're not more likely to be formally employed; they're just less likely to be self-employed. And then when we actually look at earnings in March 2020, we find that the women who got the scholarship back, 12 years ago, made significantly more money in March, and it's mostly coming from an extensive margin effect. They are more likely to have any positive earnings. Okay, so essentially they were less likely to end up with no income in March. Again in April, and then by May it's like pretty much gone. Okay, but so this suggests like that the ability to face to be resilient to the shock was much higher if you had gotten education. Okay, so since I'm out of time, let me just wrap up. This is just I just want to show this results to say that this is actually one of the cases where we have really not just descriptive evidence about if you're informal versus formal you do better or worse. We actually do have exogenous variation in your type of employment that comes from your education. And we can document that you fared better under the crisis. So, I mean, I don't really have much to say in terms of conclusion, except that I just wanted to highlight through this presentation the many interconnected domains of informality, the heightened vulnerability in times of crisis, like the one we are going through. And I'm a bit worried, to be frank, about the likely long-term impacts that this is going to have, because shock is huge. I mean, the numbers were so striking that I didn't maybe put enough emphasis on them, but we are talking about 40% drop in income. That may have long-lasting effects on children nutrition. Obviously, we also didn't even talk about the fact that schools have been closed. People may have had to deplete their assets to cope with this shock. And all of this can have very long-lasting effect if we don't put in place policies to help mitigate this. And I think that policy choices that are going to be made today, tomorrow, and for the coming years are going to be so important. We really have to think hard about that and make sure that we help our policymakers have the right information to make the right decisions, because if we don't, the progress on poverty alleviation that has been made over the past 25 years is going to be washed out, and it would be really, really sad if the progress was set back 25 years in just a few months. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Pascaline, for your presentation. It would be very interesting, the view you're showing us about the informality and how complex the concept is, that is beyond the labor market, that is also related with whole economic relation we have in society, and also the facts that you're showing us with the data about the impact of COVID-19 and how it could be different in formal and informal context. I think we have time like for 3 or 4 questions. The first one would be like informality in the view you present is like a development problem where all of these dimensional overlap are interconnected. But when one goes to the field work to understand causes and consequences of informality, people don't identify themselves as informal. How can we design and implement policies to improve social welfare in this context?
So you mean where people themselves don't think of themselves as being informal?
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes they think that they are not doing a wrong thing or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's that's. I mean, I didn't want to be too provocative in the talk, but the truth is that I don't think that the concept of informality is actually very useful. I think it's like a very wishy-washy thing, and people themselves don't think of what they are doing as being informal. That's just like that's the only system that often that they can operate in, and so having as an objective, let's reduce informality. That doesn't seem to be super helpful to me because it's like too fluid of a concept, too badly defined as a concept to be helpful. And so I think it's better to kind of like have objectives that are okay. We want people to have a safety net such that if somehow tomorrow we have to close all the markets because of COVID or any other thing, we want to be able to quickly reach people. And provide income reports to everybody. Okay, well then we need to have a system where everybody is in a database with a clear kind of like either phone numbers to which you can send money on a mobile platform or a bank account or something like that. And then we have a sense of their kind of like main source of income and a way to anticipate or proxy the likely effect of the shock on them. But and if you come at it from that perspective, people are going to be much more likely to be like, okay, sure, I'm going to put my name in the database. But if people are already being told, oh, what you're doing is informal, then they're going to be worried about some sort of like regulatory consequences from like readily admitting, yes, I do informal cross-border trade. I cross the border by walking every day and I don't pay whatever taxes at the border that I'm supposed to pay. Like, obviously I'm not going to tell you that I do that because if I think that you ever know that. So I think it's really the mindset of the regulator or the policymakers as to maybe like shift to be something like, okay, let's not just think as informality as like a problem where the informal are just evading taxes and being unproductive, but let's think of it as like a set of constraints that force people into this system that could be could be reduced.
Okay, thank you. One of the dimensions you mentioned is the payment system. So what do you think is the role of informal financial markets in a broad and interlinked view of informality? What is the role of this informal financial market in Colombia? For example, this is a prevalent problem.
So when you say informal financial market, you mean the fact that you can borrow from like a loan shark or things like that?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I think this like that's where I think the economics is particularly useful, because if people do borrow from a loan shark, if they are called, or from an informal source where it may actually be tricky. I mean, you may get like a very high interest rate, or you may kind of put your health on the line, because maybe if you don't repay, you're gonna see your kneecaps, knocked off by a baseball bat or something like that. So it's like the type of enforcement method that some of these informal lenders use may actually be, very bad, or you may have no protection from it. Like if you borrow formally, you have like bankruptcy laws, in many contexts that protect you, and so you're not going to lose everything just because you defaulted on a loan. But maybe if you borrow from an informal source, they can just like take everything away, take your roof away or something like that. So the fact that there is a demand for such loans means that there is a gap in available formal financing, and it's probably that formal system does not trust enough the repayment ability of the poor in particular to be willing to lend to them. And so it's a political decision in some sense, like, okay, if we do grant more loans to people for whom it's going to be harder to be sure that they're going to repay, or they don't have collateral, then we may have like a high default rate. So that's like a de facto an implicit subsidy. That's something that we want to do if we think that there's like spillover effects of this better credit access onto other dimensions of people's lives. And so I think of it from like, no one wants to get a bad a dangerous loan, but if there is no other opportunity, that's what you're gonna have. And also there's a lot of interconnected things. It's like people get a lot of informal loans from their shopkeepers, for example, right? So you pay the for the groceries on credit. That may be your only source of credit, okay? And then in return, you end up paying higher prices because, if you go to the supermarket, they're not going to let you, buy on credit. But if you go to your local shop, maybe the shopkeeper will let you buy on credit. But then maybe, then you end up having to only buy from there. And that means that you can be charged like higher prices because then you don't have, you can't shop for cheaper prices. So it's always like, I always think of it as, a constrained choice that people make.
Thank you for the response. Talking about the results you were showing about COVID-19, it's clear that the difference between formal and informal is making higher, right? Do you think it is also changing the priority of the public policy agenda? The issues are the same, or is public policy changing after COVID-19 in terms of informality?
I think I don't know. I think they should probably change in the sense that maybe it kind of depends on expectations, right? If there are two dimensions. One could be, okay, next time there is a crisis like that, how do we make sure that we don't have as many people who are going to be extremely vulnerable? Okay, so that would mean, okay, as we build back, there is this like new term now that people seem to be using called BBB, for Build Back Better. Okay, so as we build back, can we like set up a system whereby we are going to have much less people who are, informal in all these dimensions, so that they are less vulnerable. And definitely, I think that'd be great. Although it seems like even before COVID, it would have been great to think about that. So I think that kind of like political forces that have been maybe, at play. It's not guaranteed that they're not going to be still at play. But I think in the very short term, there is an issue of how do you help people, recover or cope if people have lost, their livelihoods, if they've depleted all of their savings, all of their assets, if they've lost their businesses. They can, if they've fallen into, poverty or deep poverty, getting people back out is going to be very tricky. And I'm very worried about the intergenerational consequences. The fact that the generation of children, in their, between the age of, experts will differ on what they think is a critical age group, but anyone from like, 0 to 12, having gone through this, like maybe, either they end up dropping out of school or like being so behind on everything, or not having enough nutrition, for the first year of life, or the, in some critical period, they may really be kind of like damaged, if I may say, from their, human capital accumulation potential for quite a bit. And I think there is some evidence out there that you can help people catch up, that, even if you suffer a shock like that, if you can compensate for it in some ways, but that requires resources, and these resources people won't have unless there are, policies that are put in place for that. So I believe that it makes sense right now to kind of like go into debt. I'm not a central banker, so I know that they don't take, I only see one perspective. So I'm sure that, some of you on the call are like, what is she talking about? I'm just giving you the development economics perspective, the micro perspective. I feel like, okay, government should go into that to help weather this shock. It's a good investment because it's going to have, positive spillovers over, the future generation, reducing the likelihood that they are forever, trapped with a lower human capital.
About the importance of monitor how the recovery is going to be in the formal and informal context, there is a question related with the data. Are you doing another round of this IPA survey for Mexico and Colombia to monitor this process of recovery?
So that's a good question. I'm not directly involved in these IPA surveys, so I don't know the answer. I suspect that their plan is to do more, but they may actually be very interested in knowing that you're interested in that. So I encourage whomever asks the question to go on the IPA Recovery website, and you should be able to find information. In fact, I do know that they did another round for was it in August 2020? But the data was not yet online. So I suspect that this is high frequency, but I don't know all the details off the top of my head. But do check out the website. They actually put out the surveys, the data whenever it's ready, and they may even be interested in in hearing of additional questions to put. There's also another resource for those of you who are interested, is the IGC, the International Growth Center, which has also been doing similar surveys in other contexts, and the aim is also to put them online at some point. So there are a lot of efforts out there. Just one caveat I want to mention is that typically those are done with existing samples. So let's say there was a study that was done on a specific sample, then you can follow up with them. So it's not necessarily fully representative. The Abidjan work that we've been doing, we are trying to be representative of it, but often the samples are not necessarily representative.
Okay, thank you, Pascaline. I think we can stop here. Thank you very much again for your presentation. You read us very interesting ideas, questions also about understanding of this complex problem. And we invite participants to join to the contributed sessions. We'll be starting 15 minutes, and also to the short ceremony who will take place at the end of the contributed session. Thank you very much again for your participation.
Thank you. Bye.
Ms. Yupa and Mr. Garcia, thank you so much. And we will now have a 15-minute break, and at 10:45 you should connect for the third contributed session. To access the session, please go to the scheduled post on the website of this conference.